I'd like to introduce Siobhan Lozada. She is going to introduce our speaker. Siobhan primarily put this event on, invited the speaker, and arranged everything. And she is here at the University of Montana from San Diego, and she just survived her first winter.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We have a very special guest that is coming all the way from Oakland, California. Okay, that's not so far away. But anyways, Dr. Eric Holt-Jimenez is the executive director of the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First, which is described as a people's think and do tank dedicated to eliminating the injustices that cause hunger and environmental degradation. He has spent the last 25 years in Latin America working with farmers' movements and has written several books, including Campesino a Campesino, Voices from Latin America's Farmer-to-Farmer Movement for Sustainable Agriculture, and Food Rebellions, Crisis and the Hunger for Justice, both of which will be available for purchase and autographing after this talk. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Holt-Jimenez.
Okay.
Sorry, you're not an executive producer, but you might as well.
No, I wish I was. Well, good evening, everybody. Wow, what a turnout. This is my first time in Missoula, and I'm really being treated like royalty, I have to say. Thank you for putting on this event and for inviting me, and thanks for this great turnout. Yeah, so I'm not good at these things, but so I direct Food First, and it's a think tank, but we do stuff. So we call ourselves a think and do tank. And we do a lot of action research, participatory action research, which means that we help people in communities to produce information which is useful to them so that they can solve their own problems and mount their own alternatives in a better way. And we've been around for about 35 years. I've been there about 5 years myself, though I've collaborated for maybe 10, 15 with Food First in the past. But Food First was started by this amazing woman named Frances Moore Lappé, and she wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet, which some of you apparently have read or heard about. Yeah, some of us oldsters know about that. She was really one of the first people to say, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong with our food, and we can do something about it, and we should do something about it. Not just something wrong with our food, but the way our food is produced actually creates hunger rather than eliminates hunger. And that was a very revolutionary idea at the time, that somehow the production of food, and in fact the overproduction of food, which I'll get to more, creates hunger. It's sort of counterintuitive. So her book sold lots of copies, and with the money she started Food First. And I stand on some very tall shoulders, being the executive director there now. Some excellent work has gone down before me. I don't know how many books we have out, and a lot of these, we put a lot of reports, backgrounders, policy briefs, this type of thing. And now we're doing more things like documentaries, and I'm even like learning how to tweet and things like that. So the talk that I was invited to give tonight was about the food crisis. And this is the title of our book, or one of our latest books on the food crisis. And I think I'm just going to go right through it and as quickly as I can, and then leave some time for discussion. If I say something which is absolutely unclear, please stop me, and then we can have like a clarifying question, right? But let's not debate or anything until we get to the end of the talk. So, some of you may have been aware of the food riots in 2008. They got a lot of press, and actually kind of started in 2007 with the tortilla crisis in Mexico. And then we began to see these food riots as food prices went up in 2008. And you saw them at first in areas and countries, regions where you sort of would expect to see a food riot. Places where people were poor, or where maybe they didn't produce a lot of food, like, Senegal and Indonesia and Haiti. But then you began to see them also in places where there was a lot of food, like Mexico, Italy, and Milwaukee. So it was clearly not about a lack of food, but it was about the high price of food. And people who were poor, whether they were in Milwaukee or in Mauritius, were not able to buy that food. And so they rebelled. Now, the press called these things riots, food riots. But after we looked at them for a while, we realized, you look at what happened in Haiti. You would expect the Haitians, who were at the time living on mud biscuits. We get a little bit of lard, and you mix it with some very fine mud, and you cook that, and you eat it. Now, women had been doing this for quite some time, pregnant women, because they got their minerals that way. But pretty soon everybody was eating these biscuits just to stave off hunger. But when the people of Haiti rebelled, they didn't storm the warehouses where the rice was. And this is the rice that came from the United States, a gift of the people of the United States. USAID delivers it. A lot of it comes from Arkansas. Bill Clinton had a lot to do with this, actually. That's not what they did. They stormed the National Palace, and they drove the Prime Minister out of the country. So these were really political rebellions, not just food riots. There were people rebelling against an unjust food system and rebelling against a government that was unable to solve the very simple problem of here's the food, here's the people. They couldn't do that. The people couldn't afford the food was sitting right there. And so they rebelled. So really it's a combination of high prices, poverty, right, and a lack of entitlement, a real lack of democracy, a lack of people having a say in their food system. So that was back in 2008. This is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations Food Price Index. So the green line is 2008, and you can see it spikes. It kind of bumps there, and then it spikes in 2008. And that's where we get all these food riots. And then it began to drop. And it began to drop for a number of different reasons. Mostly because the World Food Program began to move a lot of food out there, and governments began to do something, began to provide more of a safety net for people, temporary as it was. But some things happened that we didn't quite understand. And the prices really came back down again. And no one at first really understood why. What's going on? But then 2007, 2008, 2009, they're rising again. And now in 2010, we've got this incredible spike, like nothing we've ever seen before. Food prices have never risen as quickly as they have right now. Right? In fact, these are record high prices. They're higher now than 2008, and those were the highest prices we'd ever seen since the FAO has been monitoring prices. And they're still going up. We're now in the 9th straight month of increases in food prices. So it's back. Right? The food price inflation that we saw in 2007, 2008 is back. Now, just recently, last year, Science Magazine, this guy named Barrett published a piece in Science Magazine. It's very difficult to get into Science Magazine. It goes through very rigorous peer review. And he said the undernourished population has increased by 9% globally, despite a 12% rise in global food production per capita since 1990. What does that mean? I'm going to ask you this question. What does that mean? Anybody? What does that mean? Yes?
We have more food and more hungry people.
We have more food and more hungry people. Why? And this gentleman just said? Distribution. That means that if it's a 12% rise in global food production per capita, that means that each one of us should have had 12% more food. But the undernourished population increased by 9%. So that means that some people are not getting this food, and others are. So that means, essentially, that what Frances Moore Lappé was pointing out 35 years ago, what she said was, there's enough food in the world to feed everybody. Just not everybody is getting it. That's still true today. We still have enough food to feed 1.5 times every man, woman, and child we have on the planet. And yet, we have nearly 1 billion people going hungry. Now, you might think, well, this is just the last 20 years. You know, before we had the Green Revolution, we had these high-yielding variety seeds, and we saved 1 billion people from hunger, and Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Prize. Well, not exactly. How many people know what the Green Revolution is? Okay, good. If you don't know, ask your neighbor. So the Green Revolution was basically about transferring the industrial model of food production from the north to the global south with fertilizers and pesticides and irrigation and machinery and whatnot. Well, the heydays of the Green Revolution were 1970 to 1990, more or less. And yes, it's true, during that period, the total food available per person, per capita, rose by 11%. Right? And there was a drop in the number of hungry people. A significant drop, 16% drop in the number of hungry people, worldwide, right? Over those 20 years of the heyday of the Green Revolution. But if we look a little bit closer, if you eliminate China from the equation, and I'll explain why that's important to do in just a second, but if you eliminate China from the equation, the world, minus China, increased food production by 11%, but the increase of hungry people was also 11%. So that means people are not getting all this food. And why did that happen? How could that happen? And if you go into South America, it's worse, because the increase in food per capita was 8%, but the increase in hungry people was a 19%. So right away you see there's a problem of disparity here. It can get even worse. Now, what happened with China, and the reason we don't include China in this calculation, is because, in fact, the Green Revolution, to a large degree, was adopted, particularly in Latin America, in order to avoid things like land reform. Because if the peasantry had little small postage stamp pieces of land, and they wanted more land, why don't you just give them some inputs so they could grow more food on the land that they had? Then you wouldn't have to give them more land. Right? And that's exactly what happened. But in China, they gave away land. They gave away millions of acres of land, basically, and reorganized production completely, and had all kinds of incentives for food production and for farmers. They channeled all kinds of resources into the countryside to make sure that they were going to be able to increase productivity. Now, those weren't the things that happened with the Green Revolution in Asia or Latin America. What happened was these inputs were expensive. Fertilizer, hybrid seeds, irrigation. Irrigation, you need flat land. Machinery, you need some big credit, right? Well, small farmers couldn't get access to those resources, so they were pushed off the good land and up into the hillsides and out into what they call the agricultural frontier on the edges of the rainforest. And they went searching for nutrients with which to farm. So if you chop down the rainforest and you burn it, you get a nutrient flush, and you can get a pretty good crop for a couple of years until the weeds come in, and then you got to chop down some more rainforest. Anyway, what happened during this period of the Green Revolution, and I can say this because I was there, was exactly that these poor farmers moved off the good land, and the good land concentrated in the hands of rich farmers. And they got bigger and bigger and bigger, kind of like what's happening here today. And so you get a tremendous amount of increase in productivity on the best land, right? And then you get more land brought into production on the bad land, on the fragile land, right? Up on the hillside. And so you get a tremendous flush of food. And food is cheap, really cheap all of a sudden. Now, why did food have to be really cheap? Because most of these countries wanted to fuel industrialization. And they wanted cheap food for the cities so they could pay local workers low wages so they could compete with their goods on the world market with industrial goods. That's what that was about. The problem was when farmers were pushed off the good land onto the fragile land, they very quickly used up the nutrients. Or up on the hillsides, they lost their soil. And they got a drop in productivity. So they added more fertilizers. Kept the productivity up for a little while, and then pretty soon, another drop in productivity. Until finally the soil is basically inert, has no organic matter, it doesn't even respond to fertilizer. Right? Then those farmers go hungry. So even though the Green Revolution saved 1 billion people from hunger, most of the people that they saved from hunger were in the cities. And most of the people that began to go hungry were the farmers. And that's true today. Something like 70% of the hungry people in the world are farmers. And most of those are women. Most of the hungry people in the world today, the 1 billion hungry people, are women and children. And that's true in this country too, where we have 50 million people who suffer from food insecurity. We don't say hunger here. The USDA won't let you say hunger. If you ever want a grant from the USDA, don't write hunger in there. Write food insecurity. Remember that. Anyway, most of those 50 million are also women and children. And farm workers, food workers. The people with the worst food security in the country, the worst diets, the highest rates of obesity, heart disease, and diet-related diseases are people of color, and most of those people in the food system, processing, farm workers, restaurant workers. These are the people who produce and process and give us our food. And they're the ones who are being made sick and dying from our food because they can't afford good food. Well, in the global south, people can't afford food at all. So you have the situation where a farmer will sell their crop, because they're poor, will sell their crop immediately, right after harvest. And of course, that's when you're going to get the worst price. And 3 months later, they're buying it back. And that's when they go hungry. So it's a bit complicated. It's not that there's not enough food. And it's not that farmers can't grow the food. But it's that they're marginalized on the land that they use, on the resources that they have access to, and they're marginalized from the markets, or rather they're run over by the markets. And that's true in this country as well. So I did this slide back in 2008. It's still good. 2008, we had record harvests worldwide. We also had record hunger worldwide. And we had record profits worldwide from the agri-food monopolies that control our food system. So we have these bumper harvests, highest corn crop in history. 1 billion people go hungry. Archer Daniels Midland rakes in 20% increase in quarterly profits, 2008. Monsanto, 45% increase in quarterly profits. Cargill, 86%. It's a little bit higher because Cargill has a fertilizer arm called Mosaic, and they made out with 1,700% increase in quarterly profits. On the retail side, I just put up General Foods, 61% increase in retail profits. But Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, there's the international Walmarts basically. Same thing. You see the same pattern. So you see a overproduction, tremendous suffering and hunger, and bumper profits, windfall profits on the part of the agri-foods industry. Now, there was a lot of talk about the causes of the food crisis in the media. But I really think they only looked at the proximate causes. They said, well, climate's changing. Yeah, okay. There were some droughts in Australia. Wheat crop's been affected. Okay. You know. And the rising meat consumption in India and China. You know, they want to eat like Americans. They want all this meat, like we eat meat. You know, and of course, you know what that's going to do. It's going to dry up all the grain in the world. That's not true for India at all, by the way. India is self-sufficient in grains and meat. The other thing is they failed to mention was that, in fact, the new CAFOs in China are being opened by Smithfield Tyson. So on one hand, blame the Chinese, but it's North American companies in there establishing the CAFOs. There was a small drop in cereal production in 2005, 2006. And there were low grain reserves, certainly. But no one asked, why do we have low grain reserves? And the fact was that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund had spent 10 years going around the world making countries dismantle their grain reserves so that all these countries would be dependent on the global market for their grain, which we would sell to them. And of course, the high oil prices is happening again. Doubles your transport costs, triples your fertilizer costs. And now, and this had just started then, in 2008, we had this first big bump because so much of our corn was going over to agri-fuels. And I say agri-fuels because I don't want to insult any of you who actually produce biofuels. Biofuels is if you go out and you collect kitchen grease, or you grow some soy on your own farm and you process it on your own farm, you know, something like that. I don't have a problem with that. That's biofuels because that bio, you know, kind of life-giving. Agri-fuels is a completely different animal. It's done on an industrial scale. It's high intensity. Kind of runs against the second law of thermodynamics. But it has eaten up the corn crop. And between agri-fuels, and 40% of our corn crop here in the United States goes to fuel. And that has a tremendous impact on corn prices on the world market. Half of the corn in the world at this point either goes to animals or it goes to cars. It doesn't go to people. The weak dollar, yeah, I'll give you that. And financial speculation. See, what happened was all these little things kind of kicked in, gave us some blips. I don't know if you remember that. We had the bump in the curve, you know, it was kind of moving along like this, and the food pricing does, and all of a sudden it goes up and spikes. It goes up and spikes because of the Wall Street in Chicago speculating with the food. And basically, the amount of money that went into speculation went from $13 billion in 2003 to $317 billion in 2008, with a $60 billion increase in 2010 alone. So these are the derivatives, right? So it's like betting on futures. It's not just futures. Futures at one time were a good thing because a farmer could lock in a price. And that's important for a farmer. But then you start betting on that. That's where we get speculation. And we had dismantled the regulatory controls we had over speculation back during the Reagan administration. So basically, no one was there to stop Wall Street. After the real estate bubble was gone, they looked around and said, now what? What's next? Well, it was food. And that's what really sent things over the top. So, and that's really still true today, because there's been absolutely no regulation put in place since 2008 on speculating with our food. Now, where Food First has a problem with all of this is that it doesn't go deep enough. Those are the proximate causes. But the root causes of the food crises, these recurrent food crises that we have now, is basically that we have a food system, a global food system, which I'm going to call a global corporate food regime. I'll explain why later, which is highly vulnerable to environmental and economic shock. Because of its industrial model, because of its financialization, and because of its global reach. Well, over 91% of the world's cropland in commodities is devoted to just 5 commodities. How many people study ecology? So you know how important diversity is in terms of resilience. That's true for an economy as well. The more monolithic your economy, the less resilient it's going to be to shock. So we have a food system which is highly vulnerable to shock. Vulnerable to climate change, climate shock, and both to financial and economic shock. Now, you could say, oh dear, what a terrible occurrence. This isn't an accident. This has been constructed over the last 50 years. And in fact, there are companies who make out quite well when things are vulnerable. They like this volatility because they can speculate on the volatility. They can buy up when prices are low, and then they can sell when prices are high. And you can only do that consistently if you're a monopoly. And basically that's what we've got. We've got a huge industrial agri-foods complex, which is controlled by a handful of monopolies. Grain traders and processors like ADM, Cargill, and Bunge. The seed and genetic engineering companies like Monsanto and Syngenta, and then the retail and distributing companies like Walmart. How did this come about? Well, if you go back to the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 80s, that's where this industrial model of production from the north went south. Now, it wasn't as though the southern farmers didn't have something that wasn't working. In fact, there's a very good doctoral dissertation by a guy named Bruce Jennings. Bruce Jennings? No. Is it Bruce? It is Bruce.
faculty here.
Well, where is he?
He left to go back and do.
He was head of BST for a while.
So anyway, that dissertation, he describes how the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, who had made immense profits based on petroleum and oil, right, were wondering what to do. And there's a problem when you make a lot of profits. You think you've got it all solved. You've got a big problem because you've got to reinvest those profits. And it's called a crisis of overaccumulation. You study political economy. But you get a whole lot of money and you don't put it under the mattress if you're a corporation. Particularly if you have shareholders who expect a compound growth rate and return. You've got to reinvest that stuff. So they were looking for things to invest in, and they decided that maybe what they could do is they could take this petroleum-based model of production from the United States down to Mexico, down to Asia, right, and spread it there. And then they'd be able to expand their empire, basically, which they did very successfully. That was the first step. The second step in the rise of this industrial agri-foods complex were the structural adjustment policies of the 80s and 90s by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, just like farmers in this country are up to here in debt, the third world was indebted as well. They had borrowed from northern banks, just as our farmers had borrowed from northern banks. Now, farmers here started to go out of business. But the southern countries couldn't go out of business, and the banks weren't about to just let those loans default. So the IMF and the World Bank stepped in and said, okay, look, the World Bank said, we're going to loan you some more money so that you can pay off the northern banks. But you have to sign a contract with the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF said, what you have to do is remove all your tariff barriers, dismantle your marketing boards, dismantle all your grain reserves, and you've got to invest in non-food export crops so you can get dollars off the global market and pay off your loans. Basically, give up your food security, give up your ability to produce food for your own people, buy the food from us in the north, and sell us non-food items and luxury items, sell us chocolate, things like that. The next step in this transition were the free trade agreements. And they're still going on, started in the 1990s. And what they did basically was they took these structural adjustment programs that countries had to sign with the IMF and the World Bank, and they put them into law, international treaties. Now, why did they do that? They did it for the simple reason that once it was a treaty between, say, Mexico and the US, right, then the citizenry couldn't touch it. The citizens of Mexico couldn't just vote their president out or vote their legislators out and say, that's not what we want something else. Because it's a treaty. They can't get at it. And neither could we. Bill Clinton signs NAFTA, we can't get at it. We signed CAFTA, we got nothing to say about it. That's it, it's treaty, it's locked in. Right? And so that's where we see these free trade agreements. And then we get this tremendous overproduction in the States and this dumping of products from the north. And Europe did the same thing. I don't want to demonize only the United States. But Europe did the same thing. They basically overproduced, which brought down the price of grains down to nothing. So farmers had to get bigger, get out, right? And then they dumped this cheap grain on southern markets where the farmers in the global south can't compete because the grain is so cheap, it gets sold for prices which are below the cost of production. So those farmers start going out of business. And that's why 5 million farmers left Mexico to come to the United States and look for jobs. If people are concerned about the immigration crisis and this and that, that's where it began. When we made it impossible for people to feed themselves, made it impossible for farmers to make a living. So, overall, what are the results? The global south used to produce $1 billion surplus in food. Now they import $11 billion in food every year. Industrial agriculture now produces up to 20% of our greenhouse gases, uses up 80% of our water. We've lost 75% of our crop diversity because you can't get credit to plant heirloom corn around the world. And you get credit to plant these hybrids, which we're going to sell you. We'll give you the money, we'll give you the hybrids, now give us back the money. Anybody ever see this incredible movie, Time Bandits? Time Bandits? No? Oh, we got one. So there's a scene in Time Bandits. So these bandits, and they're actually dwarfs, and they run around the world, and they found out how to go through time, these holes in time, and they jump through, and they come out somewhere. They never know where they're going to come out, but they end up stealing Napoleon's gold, and off they go with Napoleon's gold, right? And they fall into Sherwood Forest. And there's Robin Hood. And what's the actor's name? John? Cleese. Yeah. So he's there, and he's Robin, and he's kind of this English twit, you know, with a big long green hat and a feather sticking out. He says, "Oh, so glad you could come," you know. He says, "We're here, you know, we're helping the poor. Do you know the poor? Wonderful people. Here, they don't have two pennies to rub together, but let me introduce you to the poor." And so, you know, these guys are carrying all this gold, right? And he says, "Oh, no, you've got to give it to the poor." "No, actually, you know, we don't really want." No. Here's how it's done. So the poor line up in a big line, and Robin kind of goes, "Oh, and how are you? And how long have you been poor?" "I see. Well, here, take this gold vase, will you?" And then the poor person takes the gold vase, and he walks over, and then there's Little John, right? And Little John is this thug who just goes, boom, and knocks out the poor person, takes the vase back, and puts it in the back. And so each person kind of gets their piece of gold, and then walks down the line. Little John knocks him out, takes back the gold. And that's sort of the way this works, too. I digress. Anyway, you can read some of this up here better than I can read it out to you. But basically what you see here is this big transition which ends up actually benefiting northern companies tremendously. And this is where these companies consolidate their monopoly power as never before. Now, these were big companies before. But as a result of these, as a result of this transition, they basically become mega monopolies. And these are the oligopolies now, which means that oligopolies are where they don't have to even consult each other. They kind of know what each other's going to do, so they can all work in concert in order to maintain the prices that they want to maintain. That's all. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that's all, because it's not just about capturing the market and maintaining the price, if you think about it. I don't know about this university, but I know about the University of California. There's no money in the University of California to do any research in agroecology. But BP has put in $500 million to do research on agrofuels. So the monopolies actually begin monopolizing our minds. I mean, they monopolize culture, they monopolize the media, they monopolize the philanthropies, they monopolize the research. It is more than just coinciding on market prices. So the world leaders sort of stumbled along here with the food crisis, because back in 2008 there was a food summit in Rome, and the food crisis hit the world leaders, and they didn't know what to do, and so they said, well, let's study it. So they had a high-level task force, and they set out to study the food crisis. And then there was a G8 meeting in Japan, and they talked about the food crisis. And then there was another food summit, and they talked about the food crisis. And basically, for example, in Africa, the FAO said, look, if you really want to turn around the food crisis, and you really want to get agriculture moving again in Africa, because it's been destroyed, you're going to have to put in about $40 billion. And they said, well, how about 20? Well, they settled on like $22 billion. And at the 2009 meeting of the G20 in Italy, L'Aquila, they said, okay, we're going to come up with $22 billion so that the poor can grow their own food again. Well, less than a 20th of that have we seen. Of course, we had the big financial crisis, we had to bail out Wall Street, we had to do all these other things. Who's thinking about past promises? Anyway, it hasn't been forthcoming, is the point. And whether it had been well spent is another question. About this time, there was a very interesting study that came out called the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development, the ISTAD. And this is the conclusion that it reached, that we have to change things, otherwise we're heading for social breakdown and environmental collapse. It was very interesting who was in on this study. The FAO, the United Nations, the World Bank. And this is really fascinating, because I actually know the inside story of this. I had a past life where I put on a tie along with this jacket and used to go into the World Bank and into the Inter-American Development Bank. And I would insinuate myself into the bank, ingratiate myself with one of the members of the board of directors of the bank, which I found to be surprisingly easy, and basically extract information and then share it with people on the ground who were fighting against the bank, who were fighting against the projects of the bank. It was fascinating. And everybody at the bank knew I was doing this. And I kind of wondered, why are they not stopping me? Why are they giving me this information? And the answer is that the bank is like a big poker game where the G8 sits down 3 times a week and they say, all right, I'll give you this dam in Uganda, but you give me that road across the Amazon. No. Give me the road and I want the food program. Fine. Okay, next. That's what they do. The World Bank is basically an organization, I figured out after 2 years of going in and out of the World Bank, that has been designed with a mission and a job. And the mission of the World Bank is to combat poverty around the world with excellence and professionalism. And you can get that off their website. What you can't get off their website is their job. Their job is to resolve the crisis of capitalism in favor of the G8. That's exactly what they do. Now, from time to time, the bank has gotten a lot of bad press. There was an anti-globalization movement. You may remember it. People wanted to tear down the World Bank. So James Wolfensohn, who was at the bank at the time, decided to open up the bank to consultations, public consultations with civil society. He was a very weak president. He owed a lot of people a lot of favors in order to become president of the World Bank. But he got it. But then he really couldn't do much. So he decided to reach outside the bank and get public support. So he opened up and he began to have these assessments. And we had a global assessment on mining. We had a global assessment on extractive industries. We had a global assessment on dams. And every single time James Wolfensohn did this, he would form a panel of experts and they would go out and they would look into, the extractive industries or in the dams. And they'd come back and they'd basically say, the bank is doing it all wrong. You're causing more damage than good. Everybody hates you and they have good reason to do so. But the reason I tell you all this is, one, so you realize that the bank is not a monolithic enterprise. It's fractured inside. They're fighting all the time, right? They're on the same side, but they're still squabbling. And the other is that they had opened themselves up to civil society. And they've been doing these assessments. So Monsanto, in their infinite wisdom, went to James Wolfensohn. I don't know if it was Hugh Grant. I don't know who it was at Monsanto who had this brilliant idea. But if it wasn't Hugh Grant, they'd probably been fired by now. And said, the world really needs GMOs. And Wolfensohn said, well, no, the world really needs GMOs. And so what we need is a study which shows that the world needs GMOs. That, in fact, GMOs are essential to combating hunger. So they did a study. But Monsanto hadn't done his homework, and he didn't realize that when James Wolfensohn did a study, he opened it up. And so he had 400 experts on that study from around the world. They worked for 4 years. And I know some of them. Some of them are very close colleagues of mine. And we were invited at Food First. I said, no, you're crazy. I'm not going to get involved with that. We don't have the time. We don't have the money. It's not going to end up in anything anyway. Well, I was wrong. Because they did this incredible study. And just about towards the end of the study, there was all this consolidation of information. The study is huge. It's like this thick. And you can download it. They found this. Now, this is what happens when you pull a bunch of scientists together, not just molecular biologists, but also social scientists and agronomists and agroecologists and foresters and, like science writ a little more broadly. They first said, what's the problem? So they spent years trying to understand the problem. And then after they thought they understood the problem, they began to suggest solutions. Whereas Monsanto came in and said, here's the solution. Now let's just sort of make the problem fit, right? So the thing that they found was that GMOs are not needed. The first thing is they don't raise intrinsic yields. Now, I don't know if you've had this debate here. But Monsanto says, no, our seeds are higher yielding. Well, that's poppycock. I mean, you did get higher yielding seeds with the hybrids. They were called HYVs, high yielding varieties, because in fact, the seed was bred to take some of the energy from the stalk and put it into the head of the wheat, or the corn, whatever, and you got a higher yielding seed if you applied fertilizer and water, right? GMOs don't do that. What they can do is they can reduce your losses from pests by adding BT, or from weeds, right, by making them Roundup ready. But there are other ways of doing that. You don't necessarily need a genetically engineered seed to do that. You don't necessarily need Roundup to control weeds, particularly not in the global south. I mean, here where you have big industrial farming, that's the easiest thing to do. And I understand why farmers adopt GMOs. But in the global south, with a hectare of land, 5 hectares of land, you get no advantage from this at all. There's other ways of controlling pests and weeds. And the other thing is that GMOs were not able to fully address climate resilience. Well, one, because these supposed drought-resistant seeds we're going to get aren't going to come around until 2014 or something like that, they say. I mean, they've been working for 15 years already, and they haven't come up with anything except Roundup Ready and BT. And now, all of a sudden, they're going to save the world from hunger. Well, not so fast. So maybe by 2014, we might have corn which is resistant to drought. But, okay, well, that's the corn. And most farmers are growing 7, 8, 9, 10 other cultivars. What about those? What's going to happen to those? And what happens if you have a drought and a flood? And a drought and an insect outbreak? Which is what's going to be happening with climate change, because we're introducing tremendous variability into our weather patterns. It's not just that things get drier or things get hotter. That's ridiculous. Any climate scientists can tell you that. So these really don't address the issue. And they found that the free trade agreements around the world have been just brutal. And the 90% of the agreements go to northern countries. That's the World Bank's data. And the World Bank generates all this information, and they kind of try and keep it quiet. Right? If you were to take all the benefits from free trade agreements, it amounts to about $2 per year per poor farmer. That's nothing. You're not going to combat poverty that way. And we already know that poverty is the cause of hunger. So what are you saying? And basically, ISTAT said agroecology and local food system economies were the way forward. That we had to disengage from the global market and had to implement other methods, agroecological methods of food production. Now, everybody seems to realize that small farms are important. But why Monsanto thinks they're important and why maybe you or I might think they're important are two different things. Monsanto has a real crisis on their hands. They've saturated the market here in the United States. They already sell 99% of the GMO corn in the US. Who else are they going to sell to? How are they going to provide a compound rate of return to their shareholders? Not by staying in the US market. They've got to break down international markets, or they're going to go bust. They won't be able to compete as a monopoly. That's it. People will take their money out of Monsanto shares and they'll put them somewhere else. So really, and Europe doesn't want this stuff. Europeans don't want to eat this. So they can't sell GMOs to Europe. Where are you going to sell them? Got to sell them to the poor. With this economy, the world economy the way it is, the only sector within the world economy which is growing is the poor by 8%. Well, that's a market for Monsanto. They're not going to be snide about 8%. They would like that 8%. So small farms are important to Monsanto. But small farms are important for other reasons as well. It's key to the world's food security. Because as I said earlier, most of the people who are hungry in the world are farmers. So we have to help those farmers. I didn't say that small farmers produce half of the world's food. They do. So we absolutely have to support those farmers. Pound pound for acre, they actually do produce more than large agribusiness farms in the South. Hands down. And you can look at the USDA figures on this. We have a backgrounder which goes over this at Food First, and you can look at it. And the data's from the USDA. It shows that they're more productive. I mean, you can destroy them, and you can make them unproductive, which is what happens. But all things being equal, they're more productive. And they're much more resilient in terms of sustainability. They can cool the planet because they actually capture quite a bit of carbon. And someday, when some of us feel that these GMOs crash, and think they will, we're going to have to go somewhere to find the genetic material within our food systems. And the peasantry is going to be the sanctuary of GMO-free agrobiodiversity when we try to start planting stuff back again. I was involved for about 25 years with this movement, Campesino Campesino. So I know that those alternatives are out there. I know they're highly productive. I've seen farmers like these. This is Nicaragua. I've seen farmers who are producing maybe, their land had been run over by the Green Revolution, and producing maybe a half a ton or a ton per hectare. You know, the limiting factors to productivity at that point are very simple. You know, you don't have to, is it magnesium? You know, is it, no. It's water and soil. Add soil, add water, you get 100%, 200%, 300% increase in productivity. Easy. So that's what these guys did. And they rebuilt their farms agroecologically. And they were highly successful. Spread all across Central America, Latin America, over into Africa, and into Asia. There was a study at the University of Michigan that said, can sustainable agriculture feed the world? They looked at nearly 300 studies comparing conventional to sustainable agriculture, or 300 examples in nearly 100 studies. And this is kind of important. Low estimates, the realistic estimates, and whatnot. Here, what they said is that yes, at the low estimates, organic agriculture could provide, almost all the calories that we need per person per day after losses. And this is worldwide. And at realistic estimates, it could provide quite a bit more, almost double, right? So that we can easily support a peak population of 10 to 11 billion people by 2100. This is the big deal. Everybody talks about, by 2050 we have to increase production by 70% or we're all going to starve. Well, that's just not the case at all. Now here's the deal. In the global south, when you're producing it a ton per hectare, and these are half the farmers in the world maybe, it's very easy to double that to 2 tons if you add soil and water, organic matter, and conserve water, right? So the potential is certainly there. But here in the north, where we overproduce, and I don't just mean that we overproduce in an aggregate form, and we have to export it. I mean the land itself is made to overproduce by pumping it full of chemicals and full of water. So you produce more than the land can sustainably give over generations, right? So then we're producing at, maybe 7 tons per hectare. You're not going to turn that up and produce 14 tons per hectare. Forget it. You're already maxing out. Right? It's going to be much too expensive. Whereas relatively cheaply, you could double productivity in the global south with very simple agroecological means. And I know this because I've done it, right? Aside from what these studies say. And that's what's important, because here in the north, often when farms convert over to organic, if they're chemical farms, conventional farms, and they've been overproducing, and then you convert over, you get a drop in productivity. It's frequent. And sometimes you can get it back, and sometimes you don't. But that tends to be why organic food costs more. I mean, that's the material basis why it costs more. There's other reasons that the market and the retailers and whatnot, why it costs more. But in terms of the farm gate price, that's why it costs more. Right? That margin decision is big, as it is in the South. When you go from conventional, badly functioning conventional farms that have lost their fertility, and you convert over to organic farms or not even organic, but you add the organic matter to the soil and you conserve the water, you get these huge increases in production. The United Nations did a study in Africa about food security in Africa and found that it could increase agricultural productivity and raise incomes without investing much money. And a man named Jules Pretty did that study, and he also did a book. And he basically studied all these sustainable farms around the world, mostly in the global south, hundreds and hundreds of farms. And he found that there were tremendous benefits. Right? Benefits to the community, benefits to the environment, things which we don't necessarily monetize, but over time were of incredible value. So in Africa, he looked at these 45 projects in 17 countries. Now, it's very hard to find these kind of figures anywhere else. 95% of the cases, the cereal yields improved by 50 to 100%. That's really pretty good. It's hard to find a development project which can do something like this. Right? There's an organization in sub-Saharan Africa called Participatory Land Use Management, PELM. And they spread across Africa with these techniques, farmer to farmer. And then for something like 20 years, this LESA has been documenting all of this. So the reason I put this up there is because very often you hear things said at USAID and by Monsanto or by Bill Gates or whoever, that we just can't afford the luxury of organic food because it just doesn't produce. And so, you can do that here in the United States because you can afford to pay for it, but poor people can't afford that, and certainly poor farmers can't take a chance on that. They already have, and it already works, and it's already been documented. The science of agroecology is over 50 years old. The only science in the world is not molecular biology. There are other sciences. This is a science-based movement. So what has the U.S. been doing? Well, unfortunately, the wrong thing. As I mentioned earlier, the Global South needs $40 billion a year. The North promised $22 billion. They've given almost nothing. And the trust where they put all this money is in the GAFSP, which is the Global Agricultural Facility at the World Bank, and it's broke. They have not been putting the money in there to help the Global South. The U.S. does not recognize the right to food. There is a right to food. It's enshrined in the UN Human Rights Charter in the UN. The U.S. does not recognize the right to food. We don't take a rights-based approach to development. First we ignored, then we ridiculed, and now we're actually fighting against agroecology in the U.S., and then we win, right? They've rejected. They were one of three countries, but now only two, who rejected the ISTAD. Right? Canada and England were the others, Australia. But now I think it's only England which is a holdout, England and the U.S. Everybody else has signed it, thought it was a great document. And there's this incredible revolving door between the industry and the USDA and the aid agencies, and some philanthropies, actually. And there's certainly been no regulation of any financial speculation in commodity markets. So we haven't really done anything about the food crisis, and now it's back. I'm going to wrap it up. This happens because we have a corporate food regime. And you can think of this regime, Harriet Friedman did the work on this from the University of Toronto. It's a rule-governed structure of production and consumption of food on a world scale. Think of it as all of the institutions and all of the rules which control our food. So, the World Bank, the USDA, the Farm Bill, the WTO. All these things that control our food worldwide are basically make up the food regime. And it's controlled by the monopolies and those institutions. And the way it's organized is basically industrially. It's based on fossil fuels, and it's spread a lot through now through these global animal protein chains, which just means that you grow the feed in one place and you ship it off somewhere else, and then feed it to the animals, and they ship the meat off somewhere else, right? And GMOs. The U.S., particularly the U.S., and to a large degree Europe, don't really produce things anymore. Our economy has been financialized. So we have a lot of financial instruments to extract profit from existing wealth, but we're not producing things which create new wealth, right? Our industrial sector is on the skids and whatnot. So the only thing that we can do now is called to seek rents. And seeking rents means that you get profits from intellectual property rights. So things that you own and you can sell, you can rent. So like GMOs. So that's why the Obama administration has proposed basically expansion of agribusiness and GMOs worldwide for our economic recovery, rather than proposing an industrial recovery. Do you hear industrial recovery? Not really. Not even a manufacturing recovery. No, it's about capturing these rents from intellectual property rights around the world. And that's why GMOs are an essential piece. And that's why they keep pushing these things, even though they don't necessarily address the root problems of hunger or the real needs of farmers. Now, the food regime, there was a man named Karl Polanyi who studied capitalism back in 1944. And he noticed that capitalism always went through two periods. It went through a period of liberalization and a period of reform. And in the period of liberalization, markets were deregulated. And tremendous concentration of wealth would take place. But what would happen is, if you deregulate markets forever, they eventually destroy the social and material basis for the reproduction of capitalism. So you need a period of reform to come in and control markets. And you can think about that. That happened back in the 20s, the roaring 20s. Then we had the crash in 1929. Then Franklin Delano Roosevelt institutes reform. And reform in the farm sector, too. Basically, the farmers fueled the roaring 20s, and they all went broke. Right? So they're both two sides of the same coin. Right? They're both two sides of capitalism. And we have a capitalist food system. So our food system goes through a period of liberalization, and it goes through a period of reform. And this is the last slide I'm going to show. So you probably can't read it from way up there, but that's okay. I have a backgrounder which has this in the backgrounder on the literature in the table outside. So we have this corporate food regime. And what I neglected to say was, these reforms never come about through the wisdom of reformists. In other words, FDR was a wise and good man, but he didn't bring about the reforms in and of himself. Nobody would have gone along with him. People went along with him, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, all those people guys went along with him because the country was falling apart. It looked like we were going to go communist. And in fact, it looked like capitalism was going to fall worldwide. And everybody said, wait a minute, time to reform. And, the people were rioting in the streets. There was a tremendous amount of pressure. And Polanyi calls this a counter-movement. There needs to be a social counter-movement in order to institute reform or transformation. But even if you want to get reform, there has to be a strong enough social counter-movement to bring it about. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So what we've seen around the world, and I see this at Food First, is we've seen these food movements grow up around the world. Here in the US, a lot of you are involved in food movements. Around in the global south, we have Via Campesina, we have the food sovereignty movement, we have the food justice movement here, food democracy movement, all these movements. Urban, rural, right? And it's pushing back against this corporate food regime, which is divided into a neoliberal trend and a reformist trend. They're always there. But right now, the neoliberal trend is the strongest. If some of us thought that maybe when Barack Obama was elected, it might usher in a period of reform, you will have been disabused of that notion, because he can't really institute reforms because this neoliberal trend is too strong. All right? And you see what's happening in Wisconsin. That's this neoliberal trend putting the last nails in the coffin of organized labor. The reformists are there, but they're just not very strong. And sometimes it's within the same in the same entity, like the USDA. So you have Vilsack over here with the neoliberals pushing GMOs, and you have Murrigan over here pushing community food projects, right? It's just that this has got no teeth. All the money is here. With the food movement, we have the same thing. We've got a very progressive wing. These are the doers. These are the people with the community agriculture, with the CSAs, with the farmers markets, with the farm to school programs. They're in the communities, they're getting it done, right? And they're all about agroecology and empowerment and food justice. Okay, over here you got the more radical folks. Have like Via Campesina. They're saying, let's look at the structures here. Let's have land reform. Let's get agriculture out of the WTO. Let's totally transform the Farm and Food Bill. You know, they look at the institutions and the rules. These guys are looking more at the practices, doing something different, something alternative, but they're not trying to change the rules, right? Now, these are two sides of the same coin, I would say, as well. So here's my very last comment until we talk. I think that if we expect this to change, and we expect any reforms, we need a strong social movement in order to make it happen. For a strong social movement, we need alliances between these two sectors, strong alliances. We need a strong food movement, a united food movement. Otherwise, they're never going to be able to push up against this corporate food regime. To the extent, and that's where I think you folks are really pivotal. Some of you know who you are out there. Because if this progressive trend allies itself with the reformists within the corporate food regime, then the food movement is split. The food movement is weakened, divided and weakened. If they ally themselves with more radical structuralists of the food movement, then the food movement is strengthened. Right? Now, there's a difference between tactical and strategic alliances, right? Tactical alliances are not that important. Strategic alliances are very important. And I think that's what we're facing today. There's a lot of blurriness and a lot of confusion here. But this trend, which is the big trend in the US, it's a small trend internationally. This is the bigger trend internationally. But in the US, this is the big trend. And it's absolutely pivotal. Pivotal because it can pivot this way, or it can pivot this way. Thank you very much.
And maybe repeat if people can't hear it.
Sure. So, floor is open. Yes, sir.
I've heard or read about the Gates Foundation supporting industrial agriculture.
So the question was, I've heard about the Gates Foundation supporting industrial agriculture. Is this a fact? Absolutely. I mean, Gates brought Monsanto onto his board of directors at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and has said very clearly that he doesn't see any future without GMOs, that they are the most productive. He repeats basically the mantra of this industrialist paradigm, that they produce more, that we need them for climate change. And he is behind a number of studies and partnerships, these public-private partnerships, in order to introduce GMOs into sub-Saharan Africa. We did an article in The Nation magazine on this, specifically about sub-Saharan Africa. And we have a map there which shows where the money flows. Because Gates has so much money, it goes different places. Like he gave $1 million to World Watch to document sustainable agriculture in Africa. And so everybody thought, oh, he's going to see the light. Yeah, but he gave much more to establishing labs and training in Africa for GMOs. So no, I don't believe for a minute that he's serious about agroecology or anything like that. He's very much about how to get the GMOs into Africa. Yes?
One of the things I've been reading about lately, I do a lot of ag work and get invited to conferences periodically, is conferences or a movement looking, the buzzword here is agriculture as an asset, as an investment asset. And there's all kinds of investment bankers and sovereign wealth funds of governments buying up farmland in poor countries. And how extensive is that? I read about it and talk about it, and I've seen some examples, but how widespread is that, and what are the ramifications here?
How widespread is the global investment in agricultural land by sovereign wealth funds and Wall Street and whatnot? Well, last count, about the size of France. That's the extent of the land grabs thus far that they've been able to document. These are huge, huge acquisitions of land in very poor countries for different reasons. It can be for agrofuels, or it can be to produce and export food, like to Kuwait. Kuwait will come and buy. Or Libya was buying land in Mali to produce food and export it. South Korea was buying land. Daewoo was buying land. Now, there's more than one purpose here. Sometimes it's about food. Like in the case of South Korea, they want to import food into South Korea and break the back of the farmers' movement in South Korea. There's a strong small family farmers movement in South Korea. They want to destroy their prices, drive them out of business, break their backs. So there's not a food shortage in South Korea, but they want a food surplus, so that can happen. So you can have the type of consolidation of land like you have in this country. And then there's just pure speculation. Dollars dropping, real estate bubble up here is gone. Where are you going to put your money? And buy up some land. So a lot of the World Bank, there's been no control on that, no regulation on that. The World Bank has guidelines about how to do it, supposedly in a more benign way. But there's no way to make sure that anybody follows the guidelines or anything like that. So it's a very serious problem. And I should say, we're having land grabs in this country. Now, Food First is documenting land grabs in inner cities, where Walmart and Tesco, their fresh and easy stores come over from England, and Walmart and Kroger and whatnot, have saturated the rural markets, have nowhere else to go. It's hard to break into China and India. You don't just waltz in there and start selling things. And it's hard to break into Africa. There's not the infrastructure and whatnot. So they're going into where the land has been, urban land has been devalued. They can buy it up in the food deserts in our inner cities. And they don't just go in and buy it. They need stimulus money, they need incentives, they need tax breaks. They want to make sure a lot of stuff is on the table. But there's a definite trend now towards urban land grabs here in the U.S. Yes, ma'am.
What about the Walmart investing in programs for local agriculture? That sounds very scary. So how do you keep them out?
Yeah, it is scary. And there's a big project, it's not Walmart, but there's a big project in Detroit. I don't know if you've heard about Hantz Farms. So if you've ever been to Detroit, who's been to Detroit? Looks like something out of a futuristic apocalyptic movie. I mean, all these broad expanses of urban waste and lots. And so poor people in Detroit have started to grow food on these lots. And the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network has been growing food around, and they started a food policy council. And basically taking back the food system, ensuring their own food security, about food justice. So this guy, Hantz, who's a developer, comes along and says, the problem with Detroit is that our land isn't worth enough. It's all blighted. We have to add value to the land. I mean, he's thinking like a real speculator here. We've got to add value to the land. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce industrial agriculture into urban Detroit. So it'll be urban industrial agriculture, first time ever. And there's all kinds of fanfare about this. Now, whether he's really going to do it or not, I don't know. But his whole point is he wants the city to give him land cheap so he can begin to sell off these parcels at a higher price for industrial, urban, agricultural investment. And it's destroying the food justice movement in Detroit. Well, it's not destroying it, but it's a direct attack on the food justice movement in Detroit, where people say, no, we want to grow our own food, sell our own food, keep that food dollar in our community, not have the food dollar spirited off to some corporate coffer far away, so that food dollar can be recycled and serve as an engine for local economic growth. And you think about it, you know, poor people are poor, but they spend money on food. I learned this, Lauda is here, a student of mine, actually a good friend of mine, and we spent a whole school year together traveling around the world. And we went to India, and we went to one of the slums of India, one of the oldest slums of India. And I was shocked about two things. One, to realize that the slum was a beehive of activity, tremendously productive. No one on welfare, everybody totally exploited, but producing all kinds of stuff. And two, the poor paid for everything. They paid for the water, the glass of water, they paid for that. For the piece of concrete where they slept at night, they paid rent. Right? They paid for absolutely everything. And they paid more at the end of the day than if they had an apartment. So the poor can make you a lot of money, is the point. And that's the same here. So in Oakland, in West Oakland, there's $500,000 a year spent on food. It's a food desert. And all that money gets taken out of the community. Well, that's interesting to Kroger. That $500,000 could go to Kroger, right? But we're saying, no, that $500,000 needs to stay here, or we're never going to get out of this mess. Yes?
I wrote an article in the New York Times yesterday about in Bolivia how the popularity of quinoa has encouraged the price to grow 3 or 4 times the original rate according to the market, and as a result, Bolivians who've been eating and relying on quinoa for generations are not able to afford it as readily, and the price or the rate of malnutrition has gone up with 34%. So, what's a solution? Has this happened with multiple other crops around the world? And
Absolutely.
what are the drivers?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's part of the problem of, you know, attacking the symptom rather than the disease. I mean, this was done with all the best intentions to try to provide a higher income to quinoa producers. But then it becomes, you know, a popular crop, a designer crop, basically, here in the US, where foodies can buy it, and they shoot the price up. And now people down there can't afford it. I mean, that has to do with our skewed global food system and our global market. Look, if we just did one thing, if we just paid farmers everywhere, including the United States, a fair price, a parity price, enough to cover their cost of production and make a good living. That's called parity. If we just paid them a parity price, 2 things would happen. One, the price obviously would go up. You get a price for your corn probably close to what they're getting for agri-fuel corn now, which is ephemeral. But so ADM and Cargill wouldn't buy so much of it. That's why they want overproduction, so they can buy the stuff cheap. We wouldn't have to be paying subsidies to help make up the difference, right? And then farmers in the global south would start getting a fair price for their food because they wouldn't have their markets dumped on. And we wouldn't need designer solutions to food problems. So that's why I mean the issue of the radical structural engagement in the food system is really important, because we're never going to be able to solve the problems of poverty, structural racism, the structural differentiation between the North and the South just by growing organic lettuce or just through CSAs. Those are all good things. They're very important things. We need to have alternatives in place, and we need to be moving them along. But if we don't change the rules, we will always be the alternative instead of the norm. The rules are made for the norm, for the status quo. We won't get rid of the status quo until we change the rules. We won't be able to do that until we organize.
I think we have one more question.
Yes. Ma'am.
Is your group working on getting price, well, I guess it's in trade, you try to protect your own industries, your own essential industries. It seems to me the most important goal of every country should be food self-sufficient. And it should be not only you want your own country self-sufficient, but you want every country to be food self-sufficient. And putting up those trade barriers, if you will, to protect your own agriculture. You know, it goes against free trade, but it's one of the worst things about free trade is that countries can't work towards protecting their agriculture and being food self-sufficient. Is this one of the things Food First and other groups are pushing for?
Absolutely. No, you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the problem. And that's exactly what food sovereignty means that you should have the right to be able to protect your own food system and distribute the benefits equitably, sustainably. And we can't do that as long as the WTO allows the North to dump cheap grains in the South. So countries have to be allowed to protect their food systems. Absolutely. The UN is divided, of course. There is an interesting office at the UN called the Committee on Food Security, the CFS, the Committee on Food Security. And Via Campesina, which is the International Peasant Federation, who's been advancing food sovereignty, has managed to get themselves in to the Committee on Food Security. So they're proposing these things. The problem is the UN doesn't have any money. The World Bank's got all the money. Right? The World Bank actually belongs to the UN. I don't know if you know that. But they have all the money. It's the tail wagging the dog. And the UN, it's one country, one vote, whereas the World Bank works on shares. The richest countries have the most votes. So the answer is yes, but I think that we have to be much more aware of that in this country as well. Are we?
I wanted to thank the Environmental Studies Program and the International Conservation and Development Program for co-sponsoring. We want to really thank Eric for this time.
Thank you. I'll just put in one more plug. All this work that Food First does, you'd be surprised how few we really are. And the reason we're able to do this is because we work with a lot of colleagues like yourselves and a lot of interns. So this book, Crisis in the Hunger for Justice, was written by myself and an intern, basically. It was her first publication. And now she's gone on to graduate school and whatnot. But I encourage those of you who can to consider doing an internship with Food First. Give you an idea whether or not you might like graduate school or not like graduate school or like being an activist or not like being an activist. But check us out. Okay. Thank you.